We are conditioned from birth to believe that someone is always in charge. We believe that when the fire burns too hot, the sirens will wail, the trucks will roll in, and the government will restore order. But what happens when you turn on the emergency radio, desperate for the voice of authority, and you realize the voice on the other end has been dead for months? Silence is not just the absence of noise. In the aftermath of the collapse, silence became a physical entity. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that wrapped around the ruined houses and the ash-choked streets of the suburbs. Before the pulse, the world was a symphony of invisible frequencies and constant mechanical roaring. The hum of refrigerator compressors, the distant drone of commercial airliners at 30,000 feet, the rumble of tires on the interstate miles away, and the endless, frantic buzzing of cell phones vibrating in our pockets. We complained about the noise, but it was the heartbeat of our civilization. It told us we were alive. It told us we were connected. When the grid died, that heartbeat flatlined. After my war with David, after the Punji Trench had claimed its victim and the brutal reality of territorial survival had stained my hands, the silence became my only companion. I had secured my compound. I had merged his house with mine, creating a fortress of corrugated steel, scavenged wood, and barbed wire. I had my meager crop of potatoes growing in the poisoned earth, and I had a stockpile of canned goods that I guarded like a dragon hoarding gold. From a purely biological standpoint, I had won the lottery of the apocalypse. I was warm, I was relatively safe, and I was not currently starving to death. But biology is not enough to sustain a human mind. The human brain is an engine that requires input. It needs friction. It needs the voices of others to calibrate its own sanity. Stripped of all social interaction, locked inside a dark house smelling of dust and dried mud, my mind began to turn inward, devouring its own memories. I started to forget what a conversation sounded like. I started to forget the cadence of news anchors, the rhythm of a joke, the simple, mundane exchange of a greeting. I was becoming feral, a ghost haunting my own life. It was during one of these deep, paralyzing bouts of psychological decay that I remembered the yellow box. I had found it 3 months ago, during the freezing brutality of the first winter, long before the snow melted to reveal the horrors underneath. I was scavenging a ruined outdoor sporting goods store. The looters had taken all the guns, the knives, the winter coats, and the freeze-dried meals. The place was a hollowed-out shell of shattered glass and torn displays. But buried under a collapsed metal shelving unit, kicking up a cloud of toxic gray dust, I had spotted a corner of bright, safety yellow plastic. It was an emergency survival radio. A hand-cranked, solar-powered, weatherband receiver. The kind of device suburban families bought to keep in their basements in case of a power outage during a summer thunderstorm. It felt like a relic from an ancient civilization, an artifact from a time when a disaster meant losing Wi-Fi for 48 hours. I had shoved it into my backpack without a second thought and promptly forgot about it, prioritizing calories and firewood over a piece of dead electronics. Now, sitting in the gloom of my fortified kitchen, surrounded by the crushing weight of the silent world, that yellow plastic box felt like a holy grail. I went to my supply cache, hidden under the floorboards of the guest bedroom. I dug past the cans of beans and the boxes of mismatched ammunition until my fingers brushed the smooth, hard plastic. I pulled it out. It was coated in a thin layer of grime. I brought it back to the kitchen table, setting it down gently as if it were an unexploded bomb. I stared at it for a long time. There was a profound terror mixed with the desperate hope. What if it was broken? The electromagnetic pulse that had fried the cars and the power grid was incredibly destructive. It had melted microchips and fused circuits across the hemisphere. But this radio was built for emergencies. It was simple. Analog. Maybe, just maybe, it possessed the crude shielding necessary to survive the invisible fire that had killed the modern world. My hands were shaking. They were the calloused, scarred hands of a savage, but right now they trembled like a frightened child's. I reached out and grabbed the small fold-out crank handle on the side of the unit. I began to turn it. The mechanical whine of the internal dynamo shattered the silence of the kitchen. It was a harsh, grinding, gear-driven screech, but to my ears, it was a symphony. It was the sound of effort producing electricity. I cranked the handle faster, my undernourished muscles burning with the exertion. My breath came in ragged gasps. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 3 minutes of frantic, desperate cranking. I watched the small LED indicator light on the front panel. I poured every ounce of my physical strength and my psychological hope into that handle. Suddenly, the LED flickered. It was a weak, sickly green pulse. Then, it stabilized into a solid, glowing dot. The battery was taking a charge. The circuits had survived. I stopped cranking, panting heavily, sweat stinging my eyes. I carefully extended the telescopic metal antenna, pulling it out section by section until it reached toward the ceiling like a silver metallic finger pointing to the heavens. I placed my thumb on the volume dial. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath of the stale air, and clicked it on. A loud, aggressive hiss of static exploded from the small speaker. It was pure, unadulterated white noise. Cosmic microwave background radiation, atmospheric interference, the chaotic sound of dead airwaves. It was harsh and grating, but it meant the receiver was functioning. It was searching the sky for a signal. I reached for the tuning knob. The dial had AM, FM, and WB, the NOAA weather bands, the frequencies reserved for government emergency broadcasts. I switched the selector to WB. I began to turn the knob. I moved it with agonizing slowness, millimeter by millimeter. If there was a signal out there, it would be weak. The towers were down. The repeaters were dead. I was listening for a whisper in a hurricane. The static continued to roar. I swept across the entire band. Nothing. Just the endless hiss of a dead planet. My chest tightened. The crushing despair, the absolute confirmation of our total abandonment, began to settle over me. I had held onto this tiny sliver of hope, this belief that somewhere out there, men in uniform were sitting in a bunker, broadcasting a beacon in the dark. I turned the dial back, moving even slower this time. I closed my eyes and pressed my ear directly against the plastic speaker grill, filtering out the mechanical hiss, searching for a pattern in the chaos. Wait. I stopped my thumb. I backed the dial up a fraction of a hair. The static changed. It didn't disappear, but the tone of it shifted. There was a rhythm hidden beneath the white noise. A distinct, modulated pulse. I held my breath. I adjusted the antenna, angling it slightly toward the shattered window. The static parted, just for a second, like clouds revealing a single star in the night sky. Citizens are advised. I gasped. I physically recoiled from the radio, knocking my chair backward, my eyes wide with a shock so profound it felt like a physical blow to the head. A voice. A human voice. It was faint, buried under layers of interference, distorted by distance and atmospheric ruin, but it was undeniably human. I scrambled back to the table, ignoring the overturned chair, and grabbed the radio, pulling it close to my face. I fine-tuned the dial, my dirty fingers working with the precision of a safecracker. The signal strengthened. The voice broke through the veil of static, clear enough to understand the words. to remain indoors. Do not consume open water sources. Emergency services are currently mobilizing. Stand by for further instructions from the Department of Homeland Security. I repeat, citizens are advised to remain indoors. It was a male voice. Baritone, calm, devoid of panic. It was perfectly enunciated. It was the voice of authority. It was the sound of the old world reaching out from the grave. I fell to my knees on the dirty kitchen floor, clutching the yellow plastic box to my chest. I didn't just cry, I sobbed. Deep, racking, violent sobs that tore at my throat. All the horror, the starvation, the blood on my hands, the terrifying nights spent staring at the barricade, it all suddenly felt manageable. They were out there. The government hadn't fallen. The military was intact. They knew what had happened. They were mobilizing emergency services. They were coming to put the world back together. The adults were still in the room, and they had a plan. I sat on the floor, weeping with profound, overwhelming relief, listening to the voice loop its 30-second message over and over again. It was a promise of salvation. But in the apocalypse, hope is the most dangerous poison of all, because hope makes you blind to the reality of the grave you are already standing in. For the first 48 hours, I existed in a state of manic, desperate devotion to the yellow plastic box. The routine of my survival had completely shifted. I no longer cared about the potato plants withering in the toxic soil of the backyard. I barely patrolled the perimeter of my barricaded compound. I dragged my makeshift bed, a pile of scavenged blankets and a foul-smelling mattress, directly into the center of the kitchen, right beneath the strongest point of the radio signal. My entire life was reduced to the physical act of turning the plastic crank. It was an exhausting, relentless cycle. The internal battery of the emergency radio had degraded over the years. 10 minutes of grueling, muscle-tearing cranking yielded perhaps 15 minutes of clear audio before the green LED began to dim and the static started to creep back in, threatening to swallow the voice of my salvation. My right arm throbbed with a deep, lactic acid burn. The skin on my palm blistered, popped, and bled over the plastic handle, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I sat in the gloom of the barricaded kitchen, the shotgun resting forgotten across my knees, my head tilted toward the small speaker, absorbing every syllable like a dying man drinking from an oasis. Citizens are advised to remain indoors. Do not consume open water sources. Emergency services are currently mobilizing. Stand by for further instructions from the Department of Homeland Security. I repeat, citizens are advised to remain indoors. At first, I imagined the man speaking. I pictured him sitting in a reinforced, subterranean bunker somewhere in Colorado or Virginia. I imagined the hum of massive servers around him, the glow of radar screens, the frantic, purposeful movement of generals and technicians working tirelessly to coordinate the rescue of a shattered nation. I imagined the heavy steel blast doors protecting them from the ash and the cold. I clung to that image. It was a shield against the horrors I had witnessed. It meant that David's death in the Punji Trench wasn't just a meaningless murder in a dead world. It was a temporary tragedy that would eventually be judged by the restored rule of law. It meant I was still a citizen. But the human brain is an engine of pattern recognition. We are evolutionarily designed to detect anomalies in our environment. It is how our ancestors survived predators in the tall grass. And as I listened to the broadcast for the 100th time, then the 200th time, a cold, insidious creeping sensation began to crawl up the back of my neck. I stopped cranking. I leaned closer to the speaker, closing my eyes to shut out the visual world, focusing entirely on the audio. Emergency services are currently mobilizing. Stand by. I knew the exact pitch of his voice when he said, mobilizing. I knew the precise microscopic pause before the word stand. I knew the subtle intake of breath at the very beginning of the loop. It was perfect. It was too perfect. If a human being were reading a script over a live microphone, hour after hour, day after day, there would be degradation. There would be a cough, a clearing of the throat, a slight shift in the emotional resonance of the words. A live human voice carries the weight of exhaustion, the subtle tremor of stress. But this voice carried nothing. It was sterile. It was immaculate. It was a digital recording. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the wind out of my lungs. I scrambled backward on the floor, staring at the yellow radio as if it had suddenly turned into a venomous snake. I was an engineer in the old world. I understood automated fail-safe systems. When a catastrophic event is detected by the National Defense Grid, a seismic anomaly, a massive spike in radiation, or a hemisphere-wide electromagnetic pulse, the computers don't wait for a human operator to press a button. The protocols are hardwired. Sirens activate autonomously. Blast doors seal on pneumatic triggers. And pre-recorded emergency broadcasts are instantly pushed to surviving transmitter towers. The man whose voice I had been listening to wasn't sitting in a bunker. He was a voice actor who had recorded that script in an air-conditioned studio a decade ago. He was probably dead. He was probably a pile of ash in a ruined city, or a frozen corpse in a stalled car on the interstate. There were no emergency services mobilizing. The people who were supposed to drive the trucks, fly the helicopters, and hand out the rations had been vaporized on the first day, or were currently rotting in gridlock traffic, or were fighting to the death over a can of dog food just like the rest of us. The government didn't exist anymore. It was just a ghost in the machine. A phantom echo bouncing around the dead atmosphere. A final automated reflex of a dinosaur that didn't know its brain had already been destroyed. I stared at the radio, my heart hammering a frantic, terrified rhythm against my ribs. I felt a profound, sickening sense of betrayal. The illusion of authority had been the most powerful drug I had ever consumed, and the withdrawal was instantaneous and agonizing. But the horror didn't stop there. As I watched the green LED flicker and dim, the logical part of my engineer's brain continued to process the terrifying reality of the situation. Radio waves don't materialize out of the ether. They require massive, continuous amounts of electricity to broadcast over long distances. The EMP had destroyed the power grid. That meant the transmitter tower broadcasting this automated lie was running on an emergency backup generator. A diesel generator. Diesel generators require fuel. They require massive subterranean tanks of diesel. And nobody was refining, transporting, or delivering fuel anymore. The automated facility was running on a finite supply. I lunged forward and grabbed the crank, turning it furiously. I had to know. I brought the radio back to my ear. Citizens are to remain. Do not con, open water. The static was heavier now. It wasn't my battery failing. The green light was glowing brightly. The failure was on their end. The signal was degrading. The carrier wave was losing its strength. The facility housing the transmitter was running out of gas. The massive diesel engines were sputtering, choking on the fumes of an empty tank. The automated systems were failing. The machine was slowly, agonizingly bleeding out. I didn't turn the radio off. I couldn't. Even knowing it was a digital lie, even knowing it was the automated death rattle of a fallen empire, it was the only human sound left in my entire universe. I sat there in the gathering darkness of my kitchen, my bleeding hand resting on the plastic crank, and I listened to the slow, miserable death of the old world's final breath. It took 3 more days for the ghost to finally die. Those 3 days were a masterclass in psychological torture. I stopped sleeping altogether. I sat in the corner of the kitchen, my back pressed against the cold drywall, the shotgun resting in my lap, and the yellow emergency radio clutched in my hands. I became a morbid witness to the end of an era, a solitary audience member watching the final curtain fall on human civilization. The degradation of the signal was not linear. It was a chaotic, sputtering descent into the void. By the evening of the 2nd day, the voice had become entirely unintelligible. It was no longer words. It was just a series of rhythmic, distorted groans buried beneath a roaring ocean of white noise. The atmospheric interference, no longer pushed back by the strength of the transmitter, rushed in like floodwaters breaching a dam. I had to press the speaker grill directly against my ear canal, ignoring the harsh physical pain of the static, just to catch the microscopic fragments of human cadence. Advi, door, mobili. It sounded like a man drowning in a sea of broken glass. It sounded like the very concept of order being shredded and thrown to the wind. I found myself whispering the words along with the static, reciting the mantra of the dead government. Citizens are advised to remain indoors. I said it to the empty kitchen. I said it to the barricaded windows. I said it to the mold growing on the ceiling. I was losing my grip on reality, tethered only by the invisible radio waves emanating from a dying generator hundreds of miles away. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the sun broke through the heavy ash clouds for the first time in weeks, casting a harsh, unforgiving, sickly yellow light through the gaps in my window barricades. The light illuminated the dust motes dancing in the dead air. It illuminated the filth covering my clothes, the grime on my skin, the absolute ruin of my life. I cranked the handle of the radio. The dynamo shrieked, protesting the endless abuse. The green LED flared. I put the radio to my ear. There was only a low, throbbing hum. The static had changed texture. It was no longer the aggressive hiss of a receiver trying to lock onto a weak signal. It was the flat, empty sound of a dead frequency. I panicked. I frantically spun the tuning dial, sweeping across the NOAA weather bands, tearing through the AM and FM frequencies. I twisted the antenna, pointing it at the ceiling, pointing it at the window, pointing it blindly toward the horizon. Nothing. The generator had run dry. The massive diesel engines had choked and stopped. The server banks had powered down. The transmitter had gone dark. The automated protocol had completed its final, useless cycle. The carrier wave had dropped. I sat there in the harsh yellow sunlight, holding the silent plastic box. I waited for 10 minutes, then 20, then an hour. The voice didn't come back. The silence that rushed into the kitchen to fill the void was fundamentally different from the silence of the winter. The winter silence had been an environmental condition. It was the sound of the world freezing. But this was a profound, absolute structural silence. It was the sound of complete and utter abandonment. The invisible umbilical cord that connected me to the idea of a society had been severed. There was no military convoy idling on a highway. There was no FEMA camp being constructed in a stadium. There was no president sitting in an Oval Office making difficult decisions. The trillion-dollar bureaucracies, the massive institutions we had built to protect us from the dark, were nothing more than a fragile collective hallucination. And the hallucination had finally, permanently evaporated. We were completely, utterly alone. I stood up. My joints popped and cracked from days of immobility. I felt incredibly frail, as if a strong wind could blow me away into ash. I walked over to the kitchen window and looked out through the narrow gap in the boards. I looked out at the towering, jagged barricade of pallets and corrugated steel that David had built. I looked at the punji trench I had dug, its muddy bottom still hiding the rusted stakes and broken glass. Without a government to restore order, the laws of the jungle were no longer a temporary state of emergency. They were permanent. The things I had done, the violence, the theft, the brutal territorial murder of my neighbor, were not aberrations. They were the new laws of physics. They were the only metrics of success in a dead universe. I looked down at the yellow emergency radio in my hand. It was no longer a lifeline. It was an artifact of a species that had gone extinct. It was a plastic tombstone. I unbolted the back door and stepped out onto the porch. The heat of the stagnant summer air hit me like a wet towel. I walked to the edge of the punji trench. The water had evaporated, leaving behind a cracked, dry crust of mud and blood. I held the radio out over the pit. I opened my hand. The yellow plastic box fell. It hit the jagged shards of broken glass at the bottom of the trench with a hollow plastic clatter. It settled into the dirt, resting among the remnants of the man I had killed. I didn't say a prayer. I didn't say goodbye. I turned around and walked back inside the compound. I picked up the Mossberg 500 shotgun. I checked the chamber, ensuring the heavy .00 buckshot shell was properly seated. I wiped a smudge of dirt off the cold steel barrel. The radio silence was the final confirmation. The government had disappeared. The illusion of rescue was dead. And in its absence, the man holding the shotgun was the only authority left in the world. When you spend your life waiting for a train that is never going to come, you eventually have to leave the station. The death of the radio signal was a brutal psychological amputation, but it was also a liberation. When the illusion of the government evaporated, so did the invisible chains of the old world's morality. Before the silence, I was a desperate man breaking the law to survive. I scavenged under the cover of darkness, terrified that a police cruiser or a military patrol would catch me looting. I felt a lingering sense of guilt every time I kicked in a neighbor's door or took a can of soup from an abandoned pantry. But with the radio dead, the concept of looting ceased to exist. You cannot steal from a society that has been erased. The houses around me were no longer private property. They were natural resources. They were caves filled with plastic and metal. I needed to expand my perimeter. The single can of peaches I had bled for during the neighbor's war was gone. My potato crop, planted in the contaminated, ash-choked soil of the backyard, was stunted and failing. The leaves were turning a sickly yellow, curling inward against the oppressive summer heat. I was starving again. I decided to push further out than I ever had before. I would leave the immediate suburbs and cross the highway overpass into the affluent gated communities to the west. I prepared for the expedition with the cold, mechanical precision of a soldier entering hostile territory. I wrapped my forearms in thick magazines, securing them with duct tape to serve as makeshift armor against feral dog bites or a knife slash. I strapped the heavy hunting knife to my thigh. I slung the Mossberg 500 shotgun across my back, loading the tubular magazine with 5 shells of .00 buckshot, keeping the chamber empty to prevent an accidental discharge. I took my largest canvas backpack, patching the holes with electrical tape. I stepped out of my compound at the first light of dawn. The sky was a bruised, hazy purple, the air already thick with the stagnant, humid heat of July. The smell of the dead city a few miles to the east, was a constant, rotting undercurrent in the wind. I walked down the center of the asphalt street, my boots kicking up small clouds of gray dust. There was no need to hide in the shadows anymore. Visibility was my best defense. I wanted any surviving gangs or desperate scavengers to see the shotgun. Deterrence is the only language left when the laws are gone. The journey was a tour through a graveyard of American dreams. I passed rows of suburban houses with their roofs caved in by fallen oak trees. I passed the burned-out husks of minivans and luxury sedans, their tires melted into the pavement, their interiors stripped bare. I saw the scattered, bleached bones of pets and people, picked clean by the crows and the rats. It took me 4 hours to cross the highway overpass. The physical exertion on my malnourished frame was agonizing. My vision swam with black spots, and my lungs burned with every breath of the dusty air. I descended into the wealthy enclave known as Oak Ridge Estates. The difference was immediately apparent. The houses here were massive, sprawling McMansions situated on 2-acre lots. They had deep setbacks, long winding driveways, and high brick walls. During the initial panic, this neighborhood must have been a fortress. The people who lived here had money, and money usually buys security. But security is an illusion when the threat isn't a burglar, but the collapse of the biosphere. I moved from house to house. Most of them had been breached. The massive custom doors were splintered. The floor-to-ceiling windows were shattered. The interiors were gutted, stripped of anything useful. The desperate mobs from the city center had washed over this wealthy island like a tidal wave of locusts months ago. I was exhausted. My water canteen was half empty. I was about to turn back, accepting defeat, when I saw it. It was at the very end of a long wooded cul-de-sac. A massive 3-story colonial house built from dark red brick, sitting behind a wrought iron security gate. I dropped to a crouch behind a dead decorative hedge, raising the shotgun, my eyes scanning the perimeter. Something was wrong. Or rather, something was completely right. The wrought iron gate was closed and locked. The massive oak front door was perfectly intact. There were no shattered windows. There was no debris scattered on the manicured, albeit dead, front lawn. It was untouched. In a world where every structure had been violated, an untouched house is a screaming siren. It means one of two things. Either the house was a heavily fortified trap, rigged with explosives or guarded by a well-armed, disciplined group of survivors who had successfully repelled the mobs. Or the house had been locked from the inside, and whoever was in there had never come out. My stomach growled, a sharp, twisting pain of pure hunger. The risk of a trap was immense, but the promise of an untouched pantry in a house that size was a gravitational pull I couldn't resist. I gripped the shotgun tightly. I bypassed the front gate, sliding through a gap in the dense, thorny perimeter bushes. I was going to breach the tomb. I approached the massive brick colonial from the rear, moving with agonizing slowness. I placed each foot deliberately, avoiding the dry, snapping twigs of the dead landscaping. I hugged the shadows of the brick wall, my finger hovering just outside the trigger guard of the shotgun. The backyard was an expansive patio of imported stone, leading to a drained, concrete swimming pool filled with a shallow layer of stagnant, green rainwater and rotting leaves. Beyond the pool was a large sunroom with floor-to-ceiling glass sliding doors. I crouched by the corner of the sunroom and listened. The silence was absolute. There was no generator hum. There were no muffled voices. There was no the scrape of boots on hardwood floors. I crept up to the sliding glass door and peered inside. The interior was dark, the heavy velvet curtains drawn shut in the adjacent rooms, casting the sunroom in deep, dusty shadows. I tested the handle of the sliding door. Locked. I didn't want to break the glass. The sound of shattering tempered glass would echo across the entire valley, advertising my location to every predator within 2 miles. I unholstered my heavy hunting knife. I wedged the thick steel blade between the sliding glass door and the metal frame, right near the locking latch. I applied pressure, leveraging my body weight against the hilt. The metal groaned. I pushed harder, gritting my teeth, sweat stinging my eyes. With a sharp metallic snap, the lock sheared off. I held my breath, waiting for an alarm, waiting for a shout, waiting for the blast of a shotgun from the dark interior. Nothing. I slid the heavy glass door open just enough to slip my body through. I stepped into the house. The temperature dropped immediately by 10 degrees. The air was incredibly stale, thick with the smell of dust, dried leather, and potpourri. But crucially, there was no smell of rot. There was no stench of decay. I moved through the sunroom, sweeping the barrel of the Mossberg across the shadows. I entered the sprawling living room. The furniture was untouched. Expensive Persian rugs covered the floors. A massive flat-screen television, a useless black mirror, hung over a stone fireplace. I kept moving, heading toward the center of the house. I was looking for the kitchen. I found it. It was a cavernous space of dark granite, stainless steel, and custom oak cabinetry. I walked past the dead, massive double-door refrigerator. I went straight for a solid wood door in the corner that looked like a walk-in pantry. I turned the brass knob and pulled. The door swung open. I stood in the doorway, my mouth falling open, the shotgun lowering to my side. It was a miracle. It was an absolute, impossible miracle. The pantry was the size of a small bedroom, and it was packed from floor to ceiling. It wasn't just a wealthy family's grocery haul. It was a prepper's hoard. There were rows of heavy-duty plastic shelving bending under the weight of hundreds of canned goods. Green beans, sweet corn, heavy beef stews, condensed soups, canned peaches, chili. There were massive 10-gallon plastic buckets sealed with airtight lids, labeled with black marker. Rice, pinto beans, OATS. There were dozens of gallons of purified water. There were boxes of pasta, jars of peanut butter, bottles of cooking oil, vacuum-sealed bags of coffee and sugar. It was thousands upon thousands of calories. It was enough food to keep a family of 4 fat and healthy for 2 years. It was a fortune that made the gold in Fort Knox look like useless rocks. A manic, hysterical laugh bubbled up in my throat. I had won. I had found the jackpot. The starvation was over. I could load my backpack, make 10 trips back and forth over the next week, and I would never have to worry about my dying potato plants again. I stepped into the pantry. I reached out and picked up a heavy can of beef stew. It was pristine. No rust, no dents. But as I held the heavy tin cylinder in my filthy, trembling hand, the euphoria began to curdle. The logical part of my brain, the part that had kept me alive this long, started screaming. Why was this here? Why hadn't this house been looted? And more importantly, why hadn't the owners eaten this food? People who build stockpiles like this don't just abandon them. They defend them with their lives. They fortify the doors. They stay inside. I slowly put the can of beef stew back on the shelf. The hair on my arms stood up. The silence of the massive house suddenly felt oppressive, heavy, and deeply wrong. I turned around, stepping out of the pantry, the shotgun raised once again. I needed to clear the rest of the ground floor. I walked out of the kitchen and moved down a wide carpeted hallway toward the formal dining room. The double doors to the dining room were wide open. I stepped into the doorway and froze. The adrenaline crashed through my system so violently that my knees buckled, and I had to lean against the heavy wooden doorframe to keep from collapsing. They were sitting at the massive polished mahogany dining table. There were 4 of them. The shadows in the room were deep, but the slivers of sunlight cutting through the heavy curtains illuminated the grotesque tableau perfectly. A man, a woman, a teenage boy, and a little girl. They were dressed in their finest clothes. The man wore a tailored charcoal suit and a silk tie. The woman wore a black evening gown, a string of pearls resting against her collarbone. The boy wore a blazer and khakis. The little girl wore a pristine white Sunday dress. They were sitting upright in the high-backed chairs, their hands resting neatly on the polished wood of the table. They were completely, entirely dead. The dry, unventilated heat of the sealed house had mummified them over the long months. Their skin had pulled tight over their skulls, turning into a dark, leathery parchment. Their eyes were sunken, empty pits. In the exact center of the mahogany table, resting on a silver serving platter, were 4 empty crystal water glasses. Next to the glasses was a small orange plastic cylinder. An empty prescription pill bottle. I stared at them, my breath hitching in my throat, the shotgun feeling incredibly heavy in my hands. The story of what happened in this room was deafeningly loud. They hadn't been murdered. They hadn't starved. They hadn't frozen. They had everything I had fought, bled, and killed for. They had the food. They had the water. They had the fortress. But they had listened to the radio. They had sat in this room, safe and well-fed, and they had listened to the silence of the world. They had calculated the trajectory of the apocalypse. They had looked at the prospect of living for years in a dead, violent, rotting world, hiding like rats in a golden cage, waiting for the barbarians to breach the gates. And they had calmly, rationally decided to check out. They had dressed for a funeral, poured the water, distributed the pills, and gone to sleep together as a family. I walked slowly into the dining room, the heavy carpet swallowing the sound of my boots. I stopped at the head of the table, standing next to the mummified father in the charcoal suit. I looked at his face. It wasn't contorted in pain. It was serene. He had died believing he had saved his family from the horrors I lived with every single day. I looked down at my own reflection in the polished wood of the table. I saw a filthy, emaciated savage with a shotgun. A man who had built a punji trench to impale his neighbor over a puddle of water. A man who had lost every shred of his humanity just to keep his heart beating for one more miserable day. I looked back at the pantry full of food, and then at the dead family. For the first time since the sky burned, I didn't feel like a survivor. I felt like a fool. I stood in the dining room of the dead family for a very long time. The silence in that house was different from the silence in mine. My house was silent because it was empty, save for the ghosts of my own actions. This house was silent because it was a completed story. They had written their own ending, closed the book, and left it on the mahogany table. My stomach gave another violent, twisting cramp. The biological imperative to survive cut through the existential dread. I was starving. The philosophy of suicide doesn't matter to a body that is consuming its own muscle tissue. I turned my back on the mummified family. I walked out of the formal dining room and back into the cavernous granite countertop kitchen. I went straight to the walk-in pantry. I took off my heavy canvas backpack and set it on the floor. I began to load it. I didn't take everything. I couldn't. The sheer volume of calories in that room would require a truck to move. I took the most calorie-dense, easy-to-carry items. Cans of beef stew, chili, peanut butter, vacuum-sealed blocks of sharp cheddar cheese that had somehow survived the heat, and protein bars. I packed them tightly, filling every available inch of the canvas bag. When I hoisted the backpack onto my shoulders, the weight was agonizing. It must have been 80 pounds of preserved food. The straps dug into my emaciated collarbones, grinding against the joint. My knees buckled slightly under the sudden burden. But it wasn't just the physical weight that was crushing me. It was the psychological weight of the harvest. Before the silence of the radio, when I scavenged, I felt like a hunter. I was braving the ruined world, outsmarting the gangs, and securing resources for my survival. It was a victory. Every can of beans was a triumph over death. But taking this food didn't feel like a victory. It felt like grave robbing. It felt like I was picking the pockets of a family who had realized something I was too stubborn or too animalistic to accept. They had looked at the food, calculated the math of living in a dead world, and walked away from the table. I was just the scavenger picking up the scraps they didn't want. I walked back through the sunroom, moving slowly, awkwardly under the heavy load. I didn't look back at the dining room. I didn't want to see the father's serene face again. I didn't want to see the little girl in her white dress. I squeezed back through the sliding glass door I had pried open. The oppressive humid heat of the summer afternoon hit me immediately, replacing the cool, stale air of the tomb. I retraced my steps through the manicured, dead backyard, slipping through the gap in the thorny hedge, and stepped back onto the ash-covered asphalt of the cul-de-sac. The journey back to my compound was a blur of physical agony. The sun beat down through the gray haze, baking the suburban streets. My boots felt like they were made of lead. The heavy backpack threw off my center of gravity, forcing me to lean forward, my eyes fixed on the cracked pavement a few feet ahead of me. Every shadow looked like an ambush. Every rustle of the dead wind in the dry trees sounded like a footstep. I kept my hand tight on the grip of the Mossberg shotgun, my finger resting just outside the trigger guard. If a gang of scavengers attacked me now, I wouldn't be able to run. I would have to stand my ground and fight for the food of a dead family. But the streets remained empty. The wealthy enclave was a ghost town, and the highway overpass was a monument of rusted gridlocked metal. As I crested the overpass, I looked east, toward my neighborhood. I could see the crude, jagged outline of the barricade I had built between my house and David's. I could see the corrugated steel catching the dull sunlight. From a distance, it didn't look like a fortress. It looked like a pile of garbage. It looked like the frantic, pathetic scribbling of a madman trying to draw a border on a map that had already burned to ash. I had survived the blast. I had survived the winter. I had survived my neighbor. And now I had enough food to survive the next 2 years. So why did I feel like I was walking toward a prison? I descended the overpass and entered my street. I approached the reinforced front door of my compound. I unlocked the heavy deadbolts, the metal tumblers clanking loudly in the quiet afternoon. I pushed the door open, stepped inside, and locked it behind me. I let the heavy canvas backpack slide off my shoulders. It hit the floorboards with a heavy, dense thud. I was home. I was safe. I was rich in the only currency that mattered. I leaned my forehead against the heavy oak door, the shotgun dangling from my right hand, and I closed my eyes. And for the first time since the day the sky caught fire, I didn't know what to do next. The routine of survival requires a singular, blinding focus. You don't have time to ask existential questions when you are desperately trying to melt snow for drinking water, or when you are digging a punji trench to stop a starving neighbor from slitting your throat in the dark. The sheer mechanics of staying alive consume all your mental bandwidth. But when the immediate threat of starvation is removed, the mind expands. And in the apocalypse, an expanded mind is a dangerous thing. It fills the empty space with ghosts. I spent the first hour back at my compound meticulously organizing my haul. I took the cans out of the backpack one by one, wiping the dust off the labels with a dirty rag, and stacked them in my kitchen pantry. I arranged them by category: meats, vegetables, fruits, carbohydrates. I lined them up with military precision. It was a staggering amount of food. My pantry, which had been painfully bare that morning, now looked like a miniature grocery store aisle. I should have felt elated. I should have felt an overwhelming surge of relief. Instead, I felt nothing. A cold, flat numbness had settled over my chest. I took a can of high-calorie beef stew, grabbed my hunting knife, and punctured the lid. I pried the metal back. The smell of preserved meat, potatoes, and thick, salty gravy filled the kitchen. My stomach gave a violent, demanding lurch. My mouth flooded with saliva. I didn't bother heating it. I didn't want to risk a fire, and I was too exhausted to care. I sat down at the kitchen table, dipped a scavenged metal spoon into the cold stew, and took a bite. The salt and the fat hit my starved taste buds like a physical shock. It was the richest, most decadent thing I had eaten in 6 months. My biology screamed in pure, unadulterated joy. But as I chewed, the mechanical action of eating felt wrong. I looked across the kitchen. Through the gap in the barricaded window, I could see the edge of the punji trench in the backyard. I could see the dried, cracked mud where David's blood had soaked into the earth. He had died screaming in the dark, his body torn apart by glass and rusted metal, all because he was desperate for a fraction of what I was currently eating. I looked at the can in my hand. It was the same brand of stew that had been sitting in the walk-in pantry of the brick colonial house. The house where a family of 4 had sat at a polished mahogany table and quietly, cleanly ended their lives. They had died with a full pantry. David had died with an empty one. And I was sitting in the middle, eating the spoils of the dead, protected by a wall of garbage. The cold stew turned to ash in my mouth. It tasted like grave dirt. It tasted like guilt. I forced myself to swallow it. I took another bite. I had to eat. If I didn't eat, my body would fail, and all the horrors I had endured would be for nothing. But with every bite, the silence of the house seemed to grow louder. It was the silence of the radio. When the emergency broadcast was looping, even when I knew it was an automated lie, it provided a narrative. It told me that I was a citizen enduring a crisis. It told me to hold the line. But when the signal dropped, the narrative evaporated. There was no crisis to endure. This was permanent. I put the spoon down. The can was only half empty, but I couldn't stomach another bite. I stood up and walked away from the table. I began to pace the length of the barricaded house. I checked the locks on the front door. I checked the heavy wooden board securing the back door. I checked the chamber of the shotgun. Everything was secure. I walked into the living room. The afternoon sun was fading, plunging the house into deep bruised shadows. I sat down in the armchair I used as a bed. The quiet was absolute. And then, from the darkest corner of my own mind, I heard it. Citizens are advised to remain indoors. I froze. I stopped breathing. I strained my ears, listening to the dead air of the living room. Emergency services are currently mobilizing. It wasn't a physical sound. It was an auditory hallucination. It was an echo permanently burned into my auditory cortex. My brain, starved of human connection, traumatized by violence, and suddenly stripped of its singular goal of finding food, was playing the last recorded voice of humanity on an infinite loop inside my skull. I squeezed my eyes shut and pressed the heels of my hands against my ears, pushing hard enough to cause pain. "Stop," I whispered. My voice was a dry, cracking rasp. It sounded foreign, like it belonged to a stranger. "Stand by for further instructions." The voice in my head didn't care that the government was gone. It didn't care that the transmitter had run out of diesel. It was a ghost, and ghosts don't need electricity. I opened my eyes and stared at the dark, empty room. The mummified family in the colonial house hadn't been killed by starvation or by gangs. They had been killed by this exact moment. They had looked into the endless, silent void of the future, and they had realized that surviving the end of the world is easy. Living with it is the hard part. Isolation is a physical weight. It presses against your eardrums. It sits heavily on your chest when you try to sleep. In the old world, solitude was a luxury. You took a weekend trip to a cabin in the woods to escape the noise. You turned off your phone to find peace. But that was a choice. When the solitude is mandatory, and the noise is permanently erased, the brain rebels. It begins to manufacture its own stimuli to fill the terrifying void. The days following my raid on the colonial mansion dissolved into a shapeless gray smear. I had enough food to last until the following spring. I had water. I had 4 walls and a loaded shotgun. By every metric of the post-apocalyptic food chain, I was an apex predator resting in a secure den. But the den had become a sensory deprivation tank. Without the desperate, all-consuming need to scavenge for calories, my mind was left with nothing to process but its own trauma. The auditory hallucinations grew stronger. The phantom voice of the emergency broadcast no longer just whispered in the dark corners of the room. It lived inside my walls. Citizens are advised to remain indoors. I would hear it in the rhythmic dripping of condensation from a broken pipe in the bathroom. I would hear the cadence of the announcer's voice in the rustling of the dead oak leaves outside my barricaded window. The wind howling through the corrugated steel of David's old fence sounded exactly like the static of the dying radio signal. I began to talk back to it. "I am indoors," I muttered, sitting on the dusty floor of my living room, my knees pulled to my chest. "I'm right here. I'm doing exactly what you told me to do." The house didn't answer. The silence just absorbed my voice, flattening it, making me sound small and pathetic. I started pacing. 10 steps from the front door to the kitchen. Turn. 10 steps back. Turn. Over and over, wearing a path into the hardwood floor. I was a zoo animal in a concrete enclosure, driven mad by the lack of horizon. My hygiene, already deplorable, vanished entirely. There was no one to smell me. There was no one to see the layers of dirt and dried mud caked onto my skin, or the wild, matted tangle of my beard. I was devolving. The sophisticated engineer who had understood the mechanics of an electromagnetic pulse was dead. In his place was a twitching, paranoid creature who jumped at the sound of the house settling. I stopped eating the food I had risked my sanity to steal. Every time I looked at the cans of beef stew and peaches perfectly aligned in the pantry, I saw the mummified family sitting at their polished mahogany table. I saw the empty water glasses. I saw the pills. They had recognized this exact stage of the collapse. The stage where physical survival is secured, leaving you alone with the terrifying realization that there is no future to survive for. There is no rebuilding. There is just an endless stretch of gray days, eating preserved meat out of a tin can, waiting to die of an infection from a rusted nail or a stray bullet from a wandering gang. They had chosen to skip the waiting. I began to understand them. The logic of their suicide, which had repulsed me just days ago, now seemed like an incredibly profound, rational mercy. I walked into my bedroom. I hadn't slept in the actual bed for months. It was too exposed to the windows, but against the far wall stood a full-length mirror attached to the closet door. It was covered in a thick layer of dust. I stood in front of it. I raised my filthy, trembling hand and wiped a wide circle through the grime. I stared at the reflection. The eyes that looked back at me were completely dead. They were sunk deep into dark, bruised sockets. The cheekbones jutted out like sharp rocks beneath pale, drawn skin. I looked like a corpse that had simply forgotten to stop walking. "Who are you?" I whispered to the glass. The man in the mirror didn't answer. He just held the Mossberg shotgun in his right hand, his knuckles white with tension. He looked like a murderer. He looked like the monster that children in the old world used to check under their beds for. "Emergency services are currently mobilizing." The phantom voice echoed again, perfectly timed to mock my reflection. "Shut up," I snarled, my voice cracking. I raised the shotgun, pointing the barrel directly at the center of the mirror, at the center of my own chest. "Shut up." I screamed it this time, the raw sound tearing my throat. The silence rushed back in, heavy and judgmental. I stood there, the heavy steel of the gun leveled at my own reflection, my finger slipping inside the trigger guard. The safety was off. One microscopic twitch of my index finger, and the heavy 00 buckshot would shatter the glass, shatter my chest, and turn off the phantom radio forever. It would be so easy. Just like the family at the table. Just a loud noise and then peace. My finger curled around the cold metal of the trigger. I felt the slight mechanical resistance of the sear holding the firing pin back. 3 pounds of pressure. That was the only thing standing between the waking nightmare of the dead world and absolute eternal silence. I stared into the dead eyes of my reflection. I tried to summon a reason to pull my finger away. I tried to think of a single meaningful justification for taking another breath of the ash-choked air. I thought about my career. Meaningless. My bank account. Deleted. The books I had read, the movies I had loved, the culture I had belonged to. Vaporized in a blinding flash of invisible energy. I thought about David. I had killed a man in cold blood because he wanted a sip of water and a piece of fruit. If there was a God or a universe that kept score, my ledger was stained permanently black. I had forfeited my soul to protect a patch of poison dirt. And for what? So I could stand in a dark room and blow my own heart out weeks later? The absurdity of it all was suffocating. The colossal, cosmic joke of human survival. We fight so hard, we commit such unspeakable atrocities to preserve our biology, only to realize that the biology is a prison. I pressed the muzzle of the shotgun against the glass. The reflection of the steel barrel merged with the real thing. Stand by for further instructions. The auditory hallucination spiked again, loud and authoritative, right behind my eyes. There are no instructions. I screamed at the mirror, tears of pure, concentrated rage streaming down my filthy cheeks, cutting tracks through the grime. There is nobody left to give the orders. The adults are dead. I squeezed the grip of the shotgun. My breathing became rapid, hyperventilating. The edges of my vision began to darken. The adrenaline of an impending death, even a self-inflicted one, is a powerful chemical surge. I closed my eyes. I prepared for the blast. I prepared for the shockwave that would rip me out of the apocalypse. But in the darkness behind my eyelids, I didn't see peace. I saw the little girl in the white dress sitting at the mahogany table. I saw the empty pill bottle. And then I saw the punji trench. I saw the rusted stakes. I saw the mud slick with blood. I opened my eyes. I looked at my hands. They were scarred. The knuckles were calloused and split. The fingernails were cracked and packed with black dirt. These were not the hands of a man who surrendered. These were the hands of an animal that had dug through the frozen earth. These were the hands that had shattered glass to build a moat. These were the hands that had cranked a dead dynamo until the skin blistered off, just to hear a whisper of hope. I was not the man in the charcoal suit sitting at the mahogany table. I was not the civilized creature who politely checked out when the system collapsed. The fire that had burned the world had also burned away my civilized weakness. It had forged me into something ugly, something brutal, and something incredibly stubborn. To pull the trigger now would be an insult to the sheer horrific effort I had expended to stay alive. It would make David's death meaningless. It would mean the cold, the hunger, and the terror had won. The ghost of the government wanted me to remain indoors. The ghost of the dead family wanted me to give up. The ghost of the radio wanted me to wait for a rescue that wasn't coming. I slowly, deliberately pulled my finger out of the trigger guard. I lowered the shotgun. The heavy barrel drifted down, pointing at the dusty floorboards. I looked back at the reflection. The man in the mirror was still a monster. He was still a savage covered in dirt. But his eyes were no longer dead. They were burning with a cold, terrifying clarity. "I am not waiting anymore," I whispered to the glass. I didn't need the radio. I didn't need the Department of Homeland Security. I didn't need an organized society to validate my existence. The old world was a crutch, and it had been kicked away. It was time to learn how to walk on the broken glass. I turned away from the mirror. The phantom voice of the broadcast tried to loop again in my mind, but I crushed it. I visualized the yellow plastic box sinking into the muddy water of the trench, and I mentally buried it. The voice sputtered, fragmented, and finally dissolved into true, profound silence. I walked out of the bedroom and into the kitchen. I looked at the cans of food stacked neatly in the pantry. They were no longer a curse. They were fuel. They were the energy I needed to sustain the monster I had become. I grabbed a can of peaches. I didn't feel guilty this time. I felt hungry. And hunger is the most honest emotion left in the world. The next morning, the sky was the exact same shade of dead, bruised gray it had been for months. The heat was still oppressive. The smell of the decaying city to the east still rode the stagnant wind. Nothing in the environment had changed, but everything inside the compound was different. I didn't pace the floors. I didn't sit in the dark listening for a phantom radio signal. I moved with deliberate, mechanical efficiency. I ate a high-calorie breakfast from the dead family's hoard. I drank a full liter of purified water. I felt the physical energy flooding my starved muscles, repairing the damage of the long weeks of rationing. I went to my supply cache and pulled out my gear. I strapped the heavy leather boots to my feet. I wrapped my forearms in the magazine armor, binding it tight with fresh duct tape. I secured the hunting knife to my thigh. I slung a bandolier of 00 buckshot shells across my chest. Finally, I picked up the Mossberg 500. I racked the pump action, the heavy metallic shuck-shuck echoing loudly through the silent house. It was a sound of absolute authority. I walked to the front door and unbolted the heavy steel locks. When the government disappeared, it didn't leave behind a vacuum. Power abhors a vacuum. When the massive structures of law and order collapse, power simply decentralizes. It trickles down to the lowest common denominator. It trickles down to the individual. In the absence of a president, a police force, or a military, the man with the food, the water, and the shotgun is a sovereign state. My compound was my country. My borders were drawn in corrugated steel and punji trenches. My foreign policy was deterrence through overwhelming violence. I stepped out onto the front porch. The dead suburban street stretched out before me, a gray canyon of ruined houses and abandoned cars. I was no longer waiting for rescue. The rescue ships had sunk. The cavalry was dead. The radio was a piece of plastic rotting in the mud. If there was going to be a future, I was going to have to carve it out of the ash with my own two hands. I was going to have to find other survivors, not to join them in some utopian commune, but to trade, to gauge their strength, and to ensure they knew exactly where my territory ended and theirs began. I stepped off the porch and walked past the massive jagged wall of junk that separated my property from the grave of my neighbor. I didn't look at the trench. The past was dead weight. I walked down the center of the asphalt street, my boots striking the pavement with a heavy, rhythmic cadence. I was a ghost of the old world, but I was the god of the new one. The silence of the dead planet stretched out in every direction, immense and terrifying. But I was no longer afraid of the quiet. I was part of it. I had let the noise of the old world die, and I had embraced the brutal, beautiful simplicity of the apocalypse. There were no sirens coming. There were no emergency services mobilizing. There was only me. And I was ready. #video end.